Today it's our delight today to be speaking with Dr. Perry Glanzer. Dr. Glanzer is Professor of Educational Foundations at Baylor University. He's an experienced author in the realm of education, Christian higher education, and has co-authored a number of books, including The Idea of a Christian College, a re-examination of today's university, and Christianity and Moral Identity in Higher Education. He's also the co-author of the text that we'll be discussing today, Restoring the Soul of the University, Unifying Christian Higher Education in a Fragmented Age, available from IVP Academic in 2017. Professor Perry Glanzer, it's an honor to be speaking with you today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Dr. Glanzer, as we begin, would you be willing to share just briefly about the journey you've been on in writing this book? Why is it that you chose to write this book specifically?
Well, as I studied the history of higher education, and as I looked at what's happening in Christian higher education around the world, there were certain strands that came up that I thought, well, this seems to be a key element of what has been lost or what needs to happen perhaps in the future. It was never there to begin with. And so this book emerged out of those kind of little strands that I saw in history or in present times, things that have come up from just my examination of Christian higher education in the past and in the present.
Dr. Glanzer, Clay Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor, prophesied in 2014 dramatically that perhaps in 10 to 15 years, 50% of colleges in the United States would be closed. Many commentators have had different responses to this shocking prediction. What's your view, if I may ask?
Sure. I think those kinds of predictions tend to get media attention, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why they're made. However, I think he hits upon a key thing that's happening in higher education. That's what I call the Walmartization of higher education, just like in business, where size and scope matter and help you offer things at a lesser cost if you're larger. I think that's what you're going to see in higher education. Often larger institutions are going to survive and perhaps prosper, whereas the smaller institutions, those small liberal arts colleges, are going to struggle. And we're seeing some of those close even recently, some small, both Christian and secular institutions close.
Well, you're writing on a book that is very interesting to my own Moody Bible Institute, where I'm a teacher, and I'm sure many other communities as well. In the first part of the text, Restoring the Soul of the University, for about the first 100 pages or so, you argue that the fracturing of the university, what you refer to as the multiversity, transpired far earlier than we tend to think. In fact, this fracturing of the university happened back even before the Reformation in the 16th century with the collapse of the medieval synthesis. How much of this earlier vision of the university do you think we can reclaim, given that we live in such a thoroughly pluralistic age today?
Well, in some ways, I actually am not sure we should reclaim some of that earlier, what you call a synthesis. I think the synthesis occurred with Thomas Aquinas and his thought, but in many ways, it was a synthesis in a book, his famous Summa. However, when it came to the practical workings of the university, that synthesis didn't really happen in some ways. What you had was graduate school of theology where, the synthesis was taught, but yet in the liberal arts college through which everyone passed and most people went, that synthesis didn't necessarily occur all the time. For example, a subject with which I'm most familiar, moral philosophy, was often taught using Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, and it wasn't necessarily Christian in that sense. So in one way, what I would say is the synthesis back then perhaps didn't get translated into the curriculum and the structure of the university in the way it should have. And perhaps what we need to do is not recover something, but actually think in new ways about how can we bring a Christian transformation of higher education into the structure of the curriculum, into how we do things at the ground level and not just in, the thought level.
I speak for myself, but I assume that I'm also speaking for some others when I say that part of the shocking part of your book was to locate this transition in the life of the university so long ago. I would have assumed that these changes would have taken taken place much more recently. When did you in your own research come to realize, I think this fracturing of the university, this appearance of the multiversity appeared much earlier than I assumed?
Well, probably having back with my 2009 book as I explored the teaching of moral education in America, but then I wanted to trace it back earlier. And as I started to trace back, with curriculum and what was taught in the medieval times, you come to the realization is, wait a minute, we have sort of this rose-colored glasses of how things were in the past, but yet there were some structures that in place that really prevented some real integration. And actually, there were some critics. I talk about Ramus, the French thinker at the University of Paris, and then William Ames, the Puritan theologian. And these critics actually identified this problem early on, but they didn't win the day. And you realize that even the Puritans, who were considered as radical, when they came to Harvard and when it came to Yale later, they actually didn't implement some of the things that William Ames had suggested. Even though William Ames was considered the best theologian that they wanted, taught to all the students, and he was required reading for everyone, but yet some of his recommendations as to how to structure the university or the college were not taken into consideration.
For me personally, one of the most useful and amazing parts of the book, really a marvelous historical survey that you offer in this text, is the section where you describe the development of the university all the way back to the medieval period with Hugh of St. Victor, to the rise of the German research university in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And you chart throughout this demotion of theology from the core of university studies. And again, in your survey, a lot of the action is taking place several centuries previous to this. If you were to look at the last 50 years or so, would you also identify significant turning points in higher education in the United States in the last several decades?
Absolutely. Part of what's happened, perhaps I would go back a little further, but ethics was actually, not only was theology marginalized from the curriculum, even at the very start of sort of Harvard and Yale and the early colleges in America, but then ethics became marginalized from the curriculum, especially starting in the early 20th century. It became, perhaps I would say, starting in the 60s and 70s, ethics started to come back into the curriculum. It was a very practical form. It came back as professional ethics. Well, you had implementation of medical ethics, business ethics. Many professions now have a class on sort of the law and ethics. But what that did was the larger questions, what I'd call metaphysical or theological questions, were often not addressed. For example, how does, say a Christian worldview or any worldview for that matter relate to ethics and how we practice these things in the university? Those questions are not emphasized as much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glanzer. Dr. Glanzer, in the second part of your book, you note how this fragmentation of the university has overwhelmed virtually all aspects of university life. The professors, the life and role of the professors, the curriculum, the administration, athletic programs, and even the financial models of the university with the rise of, or the advent of for-profit universities and so on. Is there an indication that the university will not continue to fragment further as we look down the road?
Well, I don't think so. I would like to hope so, but like I said, the Walmartization of higher education, you have these larger and larger institutions, and more things become siloed. Many departments don't even talk about how they relate to each other in the university. For example, I myself, when I first came to my institution, I taught in 3 different departments, and what I soon realized is the university is really not set up to have someone do this kind of interdisciplinary work, because the reward system rewards you within your department. And so there's not a lot of incentive to, say, do work that connects what I'm doing perhaps in education to theology. And so as a result, I see academically the university fragmenting even more. And then, of course, the major force of athletics. That's a whole area of its own that has just grown tremendously. And often those athletic departments are not related to the mission of the university in many ways. They're sort of their own empires. Sometimes even the funding models work that way. When you see these big, large institutions just growing exponentially, that's where the growth is largely these big institutions. I don't see a lot of hope for this reintegration, a sense of, large overarching mission, except at some few institutions. And I think, Christian higher education is the best potential here.
Dr. Glanzer, one of the leading questions that by which you frame this study, you articulate is this: can the soul of the university be saved? And by that question, I understand that you are asking, is there a way back from this fragmentation, this multiversity, to a coherent, unified vision for what the university is and its purpose and mission? Let's hover on that question just a little bit. Can the soul of the university be saved? First of all, if you'd be willing to unpack, what would it mean for the soul of the university to be saved? What would it mean for us to reclaim this vision of a university?
Sure, thanks. Yes, and of course I don't mean, obviously the university literally does not have a soul, but metaphorically speaking, I refer to the soul as really its identity and the story and narrative associated with that. All of us, even personally, we have an identity, and the way you get to know someone is through their story. And it's the same with the university. What is their core? Do they have a core identity? And what is the story that, associated with that identity that guides the university? For example, just as a Christian university, that Christian identity, and hopefully the Christian story is then what guides decision-making in whatever department, and that holds the university together. And that's really what I mean by to restore a soul would mean to make that identity primary and to let it influence and integrate into every aspect of the university's life.
Let's continue to unpack that and explore that, if we may. What would it mean for that to be successfully achieved, for the soul of the university to be saved, for this mission of the university to be integrated through all of its departments? What would be the benefit of that?
Well, I think numerous benefits. One would be that we see as Christians all knowledge is integrated and holds together in a coherent vision underneath, obviously, God's sovereignty and God's wisdom. In fact, I think the wondrous task of the Christian university is to unpack God's wisdom throughout the world and in ourselves. And so for Christians, there's a sense in which we can see these connections with knowledge. We don't just actually look and try to help students understand knowledge. We seek for wisdom, which is a whole different category. Wisdom is unpacking, aspects of how God designed the universe, things like that. So that's one of the benefits. The other benefit, especially, is there's a coherent view of the person. That humans are made imago Dei, in the image of God, and so that way we know, okay, that's what brings coherence to what it means to be a human being, is to unpack, okay, when we fully bear God's image, through example, bearing God's virtues such as love, humility, forgiveness, holiness, that's when we become more fully human. And so the coherent idea of a university and knowledge also results in that you translate into your education a coherent understanding of what it means to be fully human. And that, of course, is grounded in this idea that we are made imago Dei, but then, of course, also redeemed through Christ. And so when we're in Christ, that even gives us a fuller understanding of what it means to be fully human.
I'm singing your song, sir. When you articulate the vision and purpose of the university in such a way, my heart rises. You're singing my song, and I want to be a cheerleader for you. But for the university to operate that way, for an institution of higher education to fulfill that mission, it's going to require large-scale societal cooperation. How can that vision be articulated in such a way that the societal benefit of that achievement would be clear?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question, and certainly a challenging one. I think that certainly the challenge then for Christians is to articulate how our vision contributes to the common good, and using that kind of language, and that will require some translation. I think one of the keys to the Christian university to continue being, have its soul, is to speak theologically, and to continue to learn how to speak theologically, within its sphere. However, when you start to talk to the larger world, you have to really translate that theological language into a language that is more understood in a pluralistic society, for example. And so I think one of the things I'll have to do is point out, okay, here are the benefits of this vision, but in a way that they understand regarding the common good. For example, that, when you're doing social work or when you're doing education, that, for example, instead of maybe talking about the Imago Dei, he's talking about, human dignity and respect and what that means to have a holistic view of the person in these helping professions. Would be one example of how you might have to translate that into the larger society. But I do think it can be done. It just takes some creativity and hard work. And I would say also, the help of the Holy Spirit in guiding us.
If we were to take a moment and sort of lay out some of the pressures that you see on institutions of higher education today, perhaps Christian higher education, but however you'd like to frame that, where are the major pressure points that are bringing about this Walmartization of higher education? What's causing that?
I think part of it is just some of those are just cost factors. Right, money. When it comes down to it, when you talk to a provost or a president about an initiative you want to do, one of the things that's going to come up is, okay, how do we pay for this and how does it pay for itself? And Walmartization allows you to lower costs in a way that provide, and people and your audience coming to the university, as much as we don't like to talk about it. Those are big factors. Whenever I talk to my friends who are now sending their kids to college, those are big factors. So that's one of the pressures. Of course, too, there are other pressures, political pressures, always, all throughout the world. When I study Christian higher education throughout the world, Christian higher education can rise or fall depending upon the structures there. China had some of the early higher education in China was sponsored by Christian, built by Christian missionaries there, those early institutions. But then when the political situation changed, obviously they're all secularized. But interestingly enough, all those Christians helped start some of the most elite institutions in China. Those pressures are very real as well. If you want, I can say one more. I was just thinking, another pressure can be also just population pressures. The number of students that have come. For example, I was a part of a Christian university in Russia that we were trying to start, and I taught there a year. And it was a wonderful project. Great visionary leaders being a part of this, and was providing something unique to Russia. Russia had not really had distinctively Christian education before this. But the population was declining in Russia. And so, again, going back to those political pressures, they basically started taxing all the private institutions and basically shut them down because there wasn't enough student demand, and they wanted the state institutions to survive. So it can be a combination of pressures as well that influence Christian University.
Thank you, Dr. Glanzer, for those comments. Dr. Glanzer, I was recently at the ABHE conference, Association for Biblical Higher Education, which is as you know, is a premier organization for Bible colleges. That's not specifically the only audience you're addressing, but I'm assuming that's also a constituency within your readership. And I heard that at this conference that 40 Bible colleges have closed in the last 10 years. As we look to the future of higher education, specifically Christian higher education, what is it that you're telling schools in order to face that future effectively?
That's a great question. I think, for just thinking of Bible colleges, I think there's a couple of factors that they need to think about. One is, a lot of the great universities and colleges started as Bible colleges, and perhaps there's an opportunity to be creative and expand into, a liberal arts college, or, even more than that, into the professional domains as well. I see a lot of institutions overseas do that as well. They start as a Bible college and then, grow into a larger university. In fact, one of the largest Christian universities in Brazil, I'm just thinking off my head, it was started this way with a little, one-room situation Bible college. So, that can be an opportunity. Two, though, I'm just thinking here in the United States, I think evangelical Christians have been losing the blue-collar community. We're seeing that in the statistics. And I think that was the real ministry of Bible colleges. For people who had never had higher education, this was their first entry and step into some kind of higher education, often from blue collars. And I think that's what's hurting Bible colleges. And I think, that's part of the church's mission. I think we failed in that area. And how do we reach back out to those on the margins of society, or those who maybe don't seem to quite as needy? For example, blue collar workers, maybe as extreme poor, but yet really there's a tremendous need there. That's what just to add something. I think that's what Dwight Moody's wonderful contribution was. I think that's who he really reached out to and probably made a big difference, was in that group of blue collar workers in America. And I think that's one of his great contributions to American Christianity.
Dr. Glanzer, in the final part of your book, Restoring the Soul of the University, Unifying Christian Higher Education in a Fragmented Age, you launch a proposal that you outline as, quote, theology should strengthen the soul of the university by helping to nourish every academic discipline and every part of the curriculum, on page 230. In a few words, would you help us to understand what this proposal might look like in a few examples? Thank you.
Sure. And I'll probably start with just using the metaphor that I use in the book. Is I see theology, right, as like the blood in the body. If the university might say is a body, I think the blood need to reach every part. Now it's not, in some areas the veins might be a little small, and going into it, say like mathematics, but it needs to inform for aspect. Now, practically what that might look like, I think there needs to be some changes. The Catholics in this regard, in one, for example, change, I think have made a good one, and that is they have a vice president for mission in their upper leadership. And this person is, their task is really to make sure that the Christian aspect of the university guides every part of it. So you have someone in higher leadership who's really tasked with that part. Now, hopefully they're not the only person. And I've asked some people in Catholic universities, is this what happened? Is this kind of the Christian person, everybody else does their job? And they said, no, actually it's worked out very well, where this person is just sort of a reminder and thinks creatively about how can we do this integration. A couple other practical things is, I think, right now, most of the Bible or Christian studies or theology faculty at Christian institutions oftentimes serve the professional discipline a bit. And I think we need to think about, are there ways we can structure incentives so that they aren't just serving their professional discipline, but they're, in serving the church as the mind of the church, but also the university as a whole and all the other disciplines. And I basically say, can they, come knock on the door of other departments and disciplines and say, how can I serve you? How can we write together? How can we talk and have conversations together? And I suggest perhaps even this person should be rewarded, and that should be their sole job, is thinking about, okay, you have a theologian assigned to the social sciences, for example, and is just writing, thinking about helping, having discussion groups, for example, about how do we take Christianity into the social sciences and how do we redeem them? That would be another practical proposal that I put forward.
Thank you, Dr. Glanzer. Dr. Glanzer, if we look at the landscape of higher education, Christian or not, over the last 2 decades, we would all note the tremendous and astronomical rise of online education. As we look to the future and we anticipate that online education in some form or another will continue to be a strong, increasing factor, what does this mean for your proposal? What are the strengths and weaknesses, perhaps opportunities and challenges to fulfill this vision of a Christian university, saving the soul of the university, given that all indications point towards increased online presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is really one of the major challenges facing Christian universities, to think about this issue. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure I have the total answer there, but what I'll say is I'll start with the weaknesses and then go to the strengths. Certainly what we see in the book is online education in some ways could be seen as a result of the fragmentation, in that, liberal arts college is like, okay, this is supposed to be a holistic, environmental, immersive experience here at our university. And we recognize that experience, and particularly the co-curricular, is vitally important. In fact, lots of studies that show that students learn the most in the co-curricular, not just in the classroom. And I can certainly say that was true in my own study of college students with regard to purpose and meaning. Often it was those outside the classroom experiences that were very important, whether it's student life activities and conversations with roommates or friends and things like that. So that's perhaps one of the limits of online education is perhaps you don't have that sort of built into the structure of it. However, that being said, I think online education has the potential to do some tremendously, wonderful things. And I think too, we maybe need to rethink is that education doesn't always have to be this immersive part that we talk about. That's just one model that I think is very effective and helpful. But certainly, the pastor in another country or even in a rural area who doesn't have access, or even other students and other adults, who have families and things like this, this is where online, obviously, I think has a tremendous contribution to the Christian community. Now, the challenge will be thinking about, okay, how do we make sure in our online offerings we still have that soul? For example, I've taught in adult education when I first started out teaching, and what I notice is, a lot of those people, the core doesn't, that core part that's Christian doesn't necessarily interest them as much sometimes. They just want to get the credential. And how do you make sure that you can change those students go from, okay, we're not just about a credential. We're about, Christian parts should integrate into every part, whether you're being trained to be a K through 12 principal in our online program, that we integrated it, so well. And we also perhaps require some integrative type experiences that aren't just online, perhaps some field trips to certain kinds of places or conferences. There's a lot of the disciplines now have a Christian group of professors who are wrestling with these questions of how do we integrate faith into history or biology or education for that matter. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head really right now because you're asking a question I must say I haven't spent a lot of time on, but I think we need to.
Dr. Glanzer, if I may ask a lighthearted question, but one that I think gets to a serious point. If down the road in the future, virtual reality, which is a technology that we're experimenting with at Moody Bible Institute for educational purposes, if virtual reality really becomes something of a global phenomenon in the next decade or two, can you envision with me what would it look like to preserve and fight for the values of this soul in the educational process, given that campuses might look down the road entirely differently? We'll snap on our goggles and gather in groups in cyberspace in fantastic and created environments that are meant to have an educational structure for us all to share. What is it, as we look to this future, whether it's as wild as I portrayed or not, what is it that we do now to start fighting for the values of the soul and integrate them into whatever the future of education looks like?
Yeah, boy, again, a great question. And again, just sort of thinking imaginatively with you here, I think a lot of it is going to come down to faculty development of not only the faculty doing this kind of program, but the people developing this virtual reality. And boy, if you're thinking, imagine if there's a real focus on how do we make sure the Christian mission and the narrative and the soul of our institution gets translated into this reality. Perhaps, for example, how is the reality structured in ways that might, here at Baylor, for example, there's perhaps quotes in the sidewalk. There's symbols on the walls. There's, art up that sort of also, communicates some of the ethos of our institution. And of course, we try and intentionally structure co-curricular activities that, advance the Christian mission institution. How do you do that in a virtual reality where you don't just have a classroom meeting, but perhaps you have student groups? You have virtual reality student groups, like here we have, Intervarsity group or Crew or Young Life. How do you have those kinds of Christian student groups in a virtual reality setting where some real development takes place, in terms of just being discipled in lots of different ways and learning how to disciple others? Yeah, those are, I think, that will be the challenge. And I think it's a wonderful area to think about. How can we be more creative than others as Christians in this area?
Mm.
And not just be credential, people offer credentials.
Mm.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Dr. Perry Glanzer, co-author of the book Restoring the Soul of the University, Unifying Christian Higher Education in a Fragmented Age, available from Intervarsity Press last year, 2017. Dr. Glanzer, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us this morning.
Great. It was a pleasure to be here. Enjoyed talking about the book, and also just your questions to help think creatively and imaginatively. It certainly got my mind stirred as well.
You have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.